Hello there, seeker of silence, and welcome once more to Star-Forged Stories. Tonight we step beyond the warmth of taverns and the glow of hearthfires into a place long sealed beneath layers of dust, time, and careful forgetting. A place where knowledge was not merely hidden but guarded. If these quiet stories bring you peace, feel free to subscribe and join our fellowship of listeners who wander these paths each night. Your presence makes these journeys possible. Now if you settle in and let the tale unfold. The road that led to the sealed library had long since faded from any map worth trusting. It began as little more than a narrow trail through a stretch of forest where the trees leaned too closely together, their branches weaving into a canopy that dimmed even the brightest afternoon. By the time the sun dipped low, the path had become a memory beneath their boots, marked only by the occasional stone half buried in moss or a faint clearing where the undergrowth refused to grow. 4 figures moved along that uncertain way, their steps measured, their voices kept low. At the front walked Elrin, a half-elf whose lantern cast a steady amber glow against the trunks ahead. He held it slightly forward, as though testing the darkness itself, watching how it shifted in response. His cloak, travel-worn and patched in places, stirred faintly with each step. Behind him came Mara, her gloved fingers resting near the hilt of a narrow blade. She walked with a careful awareness, her gaze drifting not just ahead, but to the edges of the forest, as if expecting the trees themselves to lean closer and listen. Thorn followed, broad-shouldered and quiet in a way that suggested patience rather than ease. A length of rope hung at his side, coiled and ready, and a small charm of iron and bone rested against his chest, tapping lightly with his movement. The last among them was Selvi, who carried no visible weapon, only a satchel heavy with scrolls and small glass vials that chimed faintly when she shifted her weight. Her eyes moved often to the ground, tracing patterns invisible to the others, as though the earth itself whispered fragments of something older. They had not spoken for some time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the place they walked through seemed to listen. It was Mara who finally broke that stillness, her voice barely more than a thread. "You're certain it's here?" Elrin did not turn, though the lantern tilted slightly in his hand. "Certain enough," he replied. "The markers match what little was recorded. The old scholar who mentioned it, he wasn't prone to invention." Selvi let out a quiet breath behind them. "He also vanished 3 days after writing about it," she said, "which I find less reassuring than you seem to." Thorn gave a low hum, not quite agreement, not quite dismissal. "The best stories always come from places people don't return from," he said. Mara glanced back at him. "And you find that comforting?" "I find it honest." The forest shifted subtly around them, a faint rustle high above, though there was no wind to speak of. Elrin slowed, raising a hand. There, ahead. At first it appeared to be nothing more than a rise in the land, a gentle hill covered in the same moss and roots as everything else, but as they approached, the shape resolved itself. Stone. Old, dark and half swallowed by the earth. A curved arch lay embedded in the hillside, its surface carved with patterns that had worn smooth over the years, yet still held a presence that resisted being overlooked. Vines traced along its edges, thin and pale, as though they had grown there reluctantly. The entrance was sealed, not by wood or iron, but by a slab of stone that fit too perfectly into the arch, its surface unbroken save for a single marking at its center. A circle. Within it, a symbol etched with careful precision, though time had softened its edges. Selvi stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied it. "That's no simple ward," she murmured. "It's layered. Old magic, the kind that doesn't fade. It settles." Elrin lowered the lantern, its light brushing across the symbol. "Can you open it?" Selvi tilted her head, considering. Perhaps, she said, but opening is rarely the difficult part. Mara exhaled slowly, her hand resting more firmly on her blade. And the rest? Selvi gave a faint, thoughtful smile. The rest, she said, is what remains after something has been waiting. For a moment, none of them moved. The forest behind them felt distant now, as though they had stepped beyond its reach simply by standing before the arch. Thorn shifted his stance, glancing back the way they had come. No turning back for a look? He asked quietly. Elrin shook his head. If we do, he said, we might decide to keep walking. Mara let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh. Then let's not, she said. Selvi stepped closer to the stone, placing her hand just shy of the symbol, not touching it, but near enough that the air between seemed to ripple slightly. She closed her eyes. The others watched. For a time, nothing happened. Then, faintly, a line of light traced along the edge of the circle, like the first hint of dawn along a horizon long forgotten. It did not glow brightly, nor did it spread quickly. It simply appeared as though it had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. Selvi's fingers moved, careful, deliberate, following the unseen pattern beneath the surface. A second line emerged, then a third. The stone responded not with sound, but with a subtle shift in presence, as though it had grown aware of them in return. Elrin adjusted his grip on the lantern. Mara's gaze flicked to the trees once more. Thorn reached for the coil of rope at his side, more out of habit than necessity. And Selvi continued. The final line completed itself with a soft, almost imperceptible pulse. For a heartbeat, everything held still. Then the stone door moved. Not with the grinding force one might expect, but with a quiet certainty, sliding inward just enough to reveal a narrow gap. From within there came no rush of air, no scent of decay, only darkness, deep and patient. Selvi opened her eyes. "It's open," she said. No one answered immediately. They simply stood there before the threshold of something that had remained untouched for longer than any of them could measure. Then Elrin lifted the lantern once more, and without another word, he stepped forward. The lantern's glow slipped through the narrow opening first, stretching into the darkness like a cautious hand. Elrin followed, turning slightly to pass through the gap, his shoulder brushing the cold edge of the stone. The air beyond felt unchanged by time, neither stale nor fresh, simply still, as though it had settled into a state of waiting and remained there. Mara entered next, her movements light despite the tension held beneath them. Thorn came after, ducking slightly as he passed, his broad frame momentarily blocking the light before it returned. Selvi was the last to step inside, pausing only long enough to glance once more at the symbol carved into the door. The faint lines of light had already begun to fade. She let the darkness take them and stepped through. The chamber within was larger than the entrance suggested. Stone walls rose in smooth arcs, their surfaces marked by faint carvings that caught the lantern's glow in subtle ways. The floor beneath their boots was even, though worn, as if many had walked here long ago. And then, suddenly, no one had. Elrin lifted the lantern higher. Rows of empty shelves lined the walls. Or what had once been shelves. Now they stood bare, their surfaces layered with a thin film of dust that shifted ever so slightly as the group moved forward. The absence of books was almost more striking than their presence might have been. Mara ran her fingers lightly along one of the wooden frames, watching the dust gather against her glove. "They cleared it out," she said under her breath. Selvi stepped closer to another shelf, her eyes tracing the faint impressions left behind. "No," she replied, "not cleared. Removed with purpose." Thorn glanced between them. "There's a difference." Selvi nodded. "Clearing is hurried," she said. "This was deliberate. Every space accounted for." Elrin moved deeper into the chamber, his lantern casting long, shifting shadows along the curved walls. At the far end, an archway led into another passage, narrower, its edges marked by carvings that had retained more of their shape. "The main collection wasn't here," he said. "This was just the threshold." Mara exhaled quietly. "A library with an empty entrance," she murmured. "That feels like a warning." Thorn's gaze drifted to the ceiling, where faint lines intersected in patterns that suggested more than decoration. "Or a test," he said. Selvi followed his gaze, her expression tightening slightly. "Yes," she said. "A simple one." Elrin slowed. "Simple?" Selvi stepped forward, raising a hand toward the air just above the floor. "Walk carefully," she said. "Not everything here is as still as it seems." Mara's posture shifted at once, her steps becoming more measured. Thorn adjusted his footing, placing each step with quiet intention. Elrin angled the lantern downward. At first there was nothing. Then, as the light settled, faint lines became visible across the stone floor. Not carved, not etched, but embedded, as though threads of something older ran just beneath the surface. They formed a pattern, not random, a path. Selvi crouched slightly, her fingers hovering above one of the lines. "These are still active," she said. "Not in the way most wards are. They don't flare or strike. They redirect." Mara tilted her head. "Redirect what?" Selvi gave a small, thoughtful pause. "Presence," she said. "Step wrong, and you're not here anymore." Thorn's grip on his rope tightened just slightly. "And where would we be?" Selvi's eyes flicked briefly to the dark passage ahead. "Somewhere else in the library," she said. "Or nowhere that connects back." Elrin let out a slow breath. "Then we follow the path." Selvi nodded. "Yes, but not too closely." Mara frowned. "That's not very reassuring." Selvi rose, brushing the dust from her hand. "These patterns shift," she explained. "Not constantly, but enough. If you follow them exactly, you may find they are no longer where you expect them to be." Thorn gave a low, quiet chuckle. "So we walk between certainty and guesswork." Selvi's lips curved faintly. "That's one way to put it." Elrin adjusted his stance, studying the faint lines before them. "Then we move slowly," he said. "Watch each step." No one argued. The first step forward felt heavier than it should have, not because of the distance, but because of what lay beneath it. The stone did not shift, nor did the lines react, but there was a sense, subtle and persistent, that the space itself had noticed. Mara followed, her foot landing just beside one of the glowing threads. Thorn came next, his weight distributed carefully, each movement deliberate. Selvi lingered for a moment longer, her gaze scanning the pattern as though committing it to memory, or perhaps watching for something within it that had yet to reveal itself. Then she stepped forward as well. They moved like that for some time, slowly, measured. The lantern's glow swayed gently with Elrin's steps, casting shifting light across the floor, causing the faint lines to appear and disappear depending on the angle. At times it seemed as though the path ahead dissolved entirely, only to re-emerge a few steps later. The passage narrowed as they went. The walls drew closer, their carvings more pronounced here, less worn by time. Symbols repeated in careful intervals, each one distinct, yet connected by a pattern that hinted at a language long forgotten. Selvi's eyes moved constantly, tracing those symbols, her lips parting slightly as if forming silent translations. Mara noticed. You recognize them? She asked. Selvi hesitated. Not fully, she said. But they're not warnings. Thorn raised an eyebrow. That's something. They're records, Selvi continued. Not of what lies ahead, but of what has been kept. Elrin glanced back briefly. Kept? Selvi nodded. Catalogued, she said. Named, perhaps. This place didn't just store knowledge. It knew what it held. Mara's gaze shifted forward again. And now? Selvi did not answer immediately. The passage opened slightly ahead, revealing a wider chamber beyond. The lines in the floor began to thin, their glow less frequent, as though whatever force sustained them did not extend as strongly into the space ahead. At the threshold, Elrin slowed. The lantern light stretched into the chamber, revealing the outlines of tall structures rising from the floor. Shelves again, but these were not empty. Shapes rested upon them. Books, scrolls, objects wrapped in cloth and bound with cords that had not frayed with time. Mara's breath caught just slightly. So they didn't take everything, she said. Thorn stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. No, he murmured. They left what mattered. Selvi moved to the edge of the chamber, her eyes scanning the arrangement, the spacing, the placement of each item. Her expression shifted, subtly. Not fear, not quite, but recognition of something that had not yet been fully understood. This isn't storage, she said quietly. Elrin turned his head. Then what is it? Selvi's gaze lingered on a single shelf near the center, where one book rested alone, its cover unmarked, its surface untouched by dust. She took a slow breath. It's selection, she said. The chamber seemed to listen, and somewhere deeper within the library, something shifted in return. For a moment, none of them moved beyond the threshold. The chamber stretched wider than the passage behind them, its ceiling arcing high above in a shape that caught the lantern's glow and softened it, scattering it across the rows of shelves in long, dim layers. Each surface held something, books bound in leather darkened with age, scrolls tied with careful knots, small cases of wood or stone sealed with markings that had not been disturbed. Yet there was no sense of clutter. Everything stood in place with a kind of quiet order. Elrin took a slow step forward. The floor here was different. The faint lines that had guided them through the passage were gone, replaced by smooth stone that held no visible pattern. Still, he did not rush. The memory of the shifting path lingered in the way he placed his weight, as though the absence of markings required just as much care. Mara followed, her eyes moving from shelf to shelf, pausing only briefly on each item before shifting again. It was not the presence of the objects that held her attention, but the spacing between them, the way certain shelves stood empty while others held only a single piece. Thorn remained near the entrance for a moment longer, his gaze drifting back toward the passage. No lines here, he said. Selvi stepped beside him, her hands loosely folded before her. No, she agreed, which means something else is doing the watching. He glanced at her. That doesn't narrow it down. Selvi allowed herself a faint breath of amusement. No, she said again, it doesn't. Elrin moved toward the nearest shelf. A book rested there, its cover a deep worn green, the edges of its pages faintly uneven. He did not reach for it at once. Instead, he held the lantern closer, letting the light reveal the small details, the way the spine had been repaired more than once, the faint imprint of something that might have once been a title. It hasn't been touched, he said quietly. Mara approached from the side, her gaze narrowing. Or it has, she replied, and put back exactly as it was. Elrin's hand hovered just above the surface. For a brief moment, the air between his fingers and the book seemed resistant. not with force, but with presence, as though there was a boundary not meant to be crossed without thought. He withdrew his hand. Selvi watched him from a few steps away. "You felt that," she said. Elrin nodded. "It's not a ward," he said. "Not like the entrance." "No," Selvi agreed. "It's more attentive." Thorn shifted his stance. "You mean it notices?" Selvi tilted her head slightly. "Yes." Mara let out a quiet breath. "That's worse." They moved deeper into the chamber, not touching anything, only observing. Each shelf seemed to follow the same pattern. Some held clusters of items, arranged with care. Others held only one, placed at the center as though it mattered more than anything around it. And then there were the empty spaces. Not abandoned. Reserved. Selvi paused before one such shelf, her gaze fixed on the dustless wood. "There were more," she said. Elrin stepped beside her. "Taken?" Selvi shook her head. "No," she said. "Relocated." Mara crossed her arms lightly. "By who?" Selvi's eyes lifted slowly, tracing the arc of the chamber. "That's the question," she said. A faint sound stirred the air, not loud, not sharp, but distinct, the soft shift of something settling where it had not been before. All four of them stilled. Elrin lowered the lantern slightly, angling it toward the far end of the chamber. There, near the central shelves, something had changed. It was subtle. A book that had not been there moments before now rested upon a stand of carved stone, its cover pale, almost silver in the dim light. It bore no markings, no title, no visible clasp. It simply was. Mara's voice dropped. That wasn't there. Thorn's hand moved, not to a weapon, but to the charm at his chest. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Selvi took a single step forward, her eyes fixed on the book. "The library is responding," she said. Elrin frowned slightly. "To what?" Selvi did not look away. "To us." The air in the chamber shifted again, though there was no wind. The lantern flame flickered, just once, then steadied. The shelves around them seemed unchanged, and yet there was a sense that something had adjusted, as though the arrangement itself had taken notice of their presence and made a quiet decision. Mara moved closer to Elrin, her voice low. "If it's choosing what to show us," she said, "then we should be careful what we choose in return." Elrin nodded. "Agreed." Thorn glanced toward the pale book. "And if we don't choose at all?" Selvi's expression remained thoughtful. "Then it may choose for us." They approached the central stand together, their steps slow, their attention fixed on the object that had appeared. The stone beneath it was carved with lines similar to those at the entrance, though here they were deeper, more defined. The surface bore no dust, no sign of age. The book itself seemed untouched by time. Selvi reached the edge of the stand and stopped. For a moment she simply observed. Then carefully she extended her hand. Again the air shifted, but this time it did not resist. Her fingers brushed the surface. The cover was cool, smooth, and faintly reflective, catching the lantern's glow in a way that felt intentional. She did not open it. Not yet. Mara watched her closely. "Well?" she asked. Selvi's gaze remained on the book. "It's not the one we came for," she said. Thorn exhaled quietly. "Of course it isn't." Elrin leaned slightly closer. "Then why show it to us?" Selvi's fingers traced the edge of the cover, stopping just before the seam. "Because it wants to know," she said. Mara frowned. "To know what?" Selvi finally looked up. "What we're willing to open," she replied. The chamber seemed to listen again. The shelves stood still, their contents unmoving, yet the sense of presence remained. Patient, attentive, waiting without urgency. Elrin considered the book. "We didn't come for this," he said. Selvi nodded. "No," she agreed. Mara glanced around the chamber. "But if this place is choosing what to reveal," she said, "then ignoring it might not be an option." Thorn gave a low, thoughtful hum. "Or it's the only option we have." Selvi's hand rested lightly against the cover. "We can leave it," she said, "and move deeper." Elrin met her gaze. "And if deeper means we don't come back?" Selvi did not answer immediately. The lantern's glow flickered once more, softer this time, as though the light itself had grown curious. Finally, she spoke. "Then we accept that this place was never meant to be taken in pieces," she said. Mara shifted her weight. "Meaning?" Selvi's eyes returned to the book. "It's not hiding a single thing," she said. "It's deciding how much of itself we can carry." For a time, no one moved. The pale book rested between them, unchanged, offering nothing, demanding nothing. And yet, its presence filled the space more completely than any sound could have. At last, Elrin straightened slightly. "We go deeper," he said. Mara nodded, though her gaze lingered on the book for a moment longer. Thorn stepped back from the stand, his attention already shifting toward the far side of the chamber. Selvi's hand remained where it was for a breath more. Then she withdrew it. The book did not move. The chamber did not change. But as they turned toward the deeper passage beyond the shelves, the faintest impression settled over them, as though something had taken note of their choice and was waiting to see what would follow. They left the pale book where it rested. No mark of refusal followed them, no sound of shifting stone or sudden change in the air. The chamber remained as it had been, its shelves unmoving, its quiet order undisturbed. Yet the feeling of being observed did not fade. If anything, it settled more closely around them, not as a threat but as a presence that had grown attentive. Elrin led the way toward the far end of the chamber, where a second passage revealed itself between two tall shelves. Unlike the entrance they had come through, this opening bore no carvings along its edge, no symbols to mark its purpose. It simply existed, a narrow corridor extending into deeper darkness. The lantern's glow reached only a short distance within. Mara paused at the threshold, her gaze lingering behind them for a moment longer. "The book will still be there when we return," she said. Thorn glanced at her. "You sound like you're convincing yourself." Mara gave a small shrug. "I am." Selvi stepped beside her, her eyes not on the chamber behind but on the passage ahead. "Things here don't leave," she said. "They shift, but not without reason." Elrin adjusted his grip on the lantern. "Then we give it one," he said, and stepped forward. The corridor was narrower than the last, its walls closer, its ceiling lower. The stone here felt older, or perhaps simply less touched by whatever order governed the outer chamber. Fine cracks traced along the surface, thin and branching, though none seemed deep enough to suggest collapse. Their footsteps echoed more clearly now, not loudly, but distinctly enough that each movement returned to them a moment later, softened, as though the space itself absorbed the edges of sound. Mara walked close behind Elrin, her eyes shifting between the walls and the floor. "No markings," she said quietly. "No lines, no wards." Thorn followed, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling, then lowering again. "That we can see," he added. Selvi trailed slightly behind them, her pace unhurried, her attention drifting not just to what lay ahead, but to what lingered just out of sight. "The earlier traps were meant to guide," she said. "These are meant to test something else." Elrin slowed. "Such as?" Selvi considered. Restraint, she said. Mara let out a faint breath. That's not a skill most adventurers are known for. Thorn gave a low chuckle. Speak for yourself. The corridor curved gently, though not enough to obscure what lay ahead. After some distance, the walls began to widen again, the space opening into another chamber, smaller than the last, but no less deliberate in its design. Unlike the first room, this one held no shelves. Instead, 4 stone pedestals stood at equal distances from one another, arranged in a square. Upon each rested an object, distinct in shape and purpose. Elrin stepped into the chamber slowly, raising the lantern. The light revealed them one by one. On the nearest pedestal lay a narrow dagger, its blade thin and slightly curved, the metal catching the light in a dull, muted sheen. It bore no ornament, no inscription, only the faint signs of careful use. Across from it rested a small sealed vial, its glass darkened, the liquid within impossible to discern. A stopper of black wax sealed its neck, unbroken. To the left stood a book, smaller than the one they had left behind, bound in deep brown leather. Its edges were worn, but its clasp remained intact, a simple loop of metal holding it closed. And to the right, a key. Long, slender, its teeth intricate and uneven, as though crafted not for a simple lock but for something more complex. Mara's gaze moved across the 4 objects, her expression tightening slightly. I don't like this, she said. Thorn stepped further in, his boots echoing softly against the stone. It's too arranged, he said. Selvi nodded. Too balanced, she added. Elrin lowered the lantern slightly, its light settling at the center of the chamber. No dust, he observed. No wear on the floor. Mara crossed her arms. No sign of anyone else passing through, she said. Thorn glanced back toward the corridor, and no other way out. And for a moment they simply stood there, each taking in the quiet symmetry of the room. Then Selvi stepped forward. 4 objects, she said. 4 choices. Mara tilted her head. You think we have to pick one? Selvi did not answer immediately. Instead, she approached the nearest pedestal, her eyes moving over the dagger without touching it. I think, she said slowly, that the library wants to see what we value. Thorn gave a low hum. And if we value none of them? Selvi glanced at him. Then we've already made a choice. Elrin moved to the center of the chamber, turning slowly as he studied each pedestal in turn. The dagger, he said. Direct, practical. Mara stepped closer to the vial. The liquid could be anything, she murmured. Poison. Or something far more useful. Thorn approached the key, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the pedestal, not yet touching it. Keys open things, he said, or close them. Selvi stood before the book, her gaze steady. And knowledge, she said, has a way of shaping all the rest. The lantern flame flickered once, casting their shadows across the walls in long, shifting forms. For a brief moment, those shadows did not align perfectly with their movements, lagging just slightly behind as though considering something before following. Mara noticed. Her voice dropped. You saw that? Thorn nodded. I did. Elrin exhaled slowly. It's reacting again, he said. Selvi's eyes moved across the objects once more. No, she said. It's waiting. The air in the chamber felt unchanged, and yet there was a tension beneath it now, subtle but unmistakable. Not urgency, not danger, but expectation. Elrin turned to the others. We can't take all of them, he said. That much is clear. Mara nodded. And leaving without choosing, she asked. Thorn gave a small shrug. We try, and see what happens. Selvy's gaze remained on the book. It won't stop us, she said. Elrin frowned slightly. No? Selvy shook her head. It will simply remember. Mara let out a quiet breath. That's not comforting. Selvy's lips curved faintly. It's not meant to be. They stood there, each near a different pedestal, the lantern's glow holding the center of the room in a steady light. The dagger, the vial, the book, the key. 4 objects, 4 choices. And somewhere beyond the walls of the chamber, deeper within the unseen reaches of the library, something continued to watch, not with impatience, but with a steady, unwavering interest, as though this moment mattered more than any step they had taken before. Elrin's hand tightened slightly around the lantern. Mara's fingers hovered just above the vial. Thorn's gaze remained fixed on the key. Selvy stood before the book, her expression unreadable. No one spoke. Not yet. Because whatever choice they made next would not remain confined to this room. For a while, no one reached for anything. The chamber held them in its careful balance, as though even the act of choosing required a kind of quiet alignment they had not yet found. Elrin shifted his stance slightly, the lantern in his hand casting a slow arc of light across the 4 pedestals. The glow brushed over steel, glass, leather, and iron, each surface responding differently, each holding its own presence. Mara exhaled through her nose. I don't like puzzles that don't explain themselves, she murmured. Thorn gave a faint tilt of his head. Better than the kind that explain too much, he said. Those usually leave something out. Selvy remained still, her gaze fixed on the small book before her. It's not a puzzle, she said. Not in the way we think. Mara glanced at her. Then what is it? Selvy's fingers hovered just above the clasp. A reflection, she replied. Not of who we are, but of what we choose when no one is guiding us. Elrin considered that. Then we choose carefully, he said. Selvy's lips curved just slightly. We already are. Mara was the first to move, not abruptly, not with certainty, but with a measured step toward the vial. Her gloved hand hovered over it, her gaze narrowing as she studied the dark glass, the sealed wax, the faint swirl within that might have been imagined. It could be anything, she said. Thorn watched her. That's what makes it tempting. Mara let out a quiet breath. Or dangerous. She turned her hand slightly as though weighing the decision not just in thought, but in feeling. Then, gently, she touched the vial. Nothing happened. No sound, no shift in the air, no sudden change in the light. But Mara stilled. Her eyes narrowed further, her posture tightening for just a moment. Then she withdrew her hand. What is it? Elrin asked. Mara shook her head once. It's not meant for me, she said. Thorn raised an eyebrow. You got that from touching it? Mara nodded faintly. It didn't resist, she said, but it didn't accept either. Selvy gave a small, thoughtful incline of her head. That's part of it, she said. Recognition. Mara stepped back from the pedestal. Then I'm not the one it's looking for. Thorn approached the key. His steps were steady, his gaze fixed on the long, uneven teeth of the metal, tracing their shape as though trying to imagine the lock they belonged to. It looks simple, he said. Mara let out a quiet breath behind him. That's usually when it isn't. Thorn reached out, his fingers closing around the key. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, faintly, the air shifted, not sharply, not enough to startle, but just enough that the lantern's flame leaned ever so slightly toward him. Thorn's expression remained calm. He lifted the key. It felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in presence. He turned it once in his hand, the metal catching the light. Then he paused. A faint crease formed between his brows. Selvi watched him closely. "You feel it," she said. Thorn nodded once. "It doesn't open something ahead," he said slowly. "It closes something behind," Mara frowned. "That sounds worse." Thorn gave a small shrug. "Depends on what you're leaving behind." He lowered the key slightly, considering it. Then, just as carefully, he placed it back on the pedestal. The shift in the air eased at once. Elrin glanced at him. "Not yours either?" Thorn shook his head. "Not today," he said. Elrin stepped toward the dagger. The blade rested where it had been, its surface dull, unassuming, yet precise in its shape. He did not hesitate long. His hand reached out, fingers wrapping around the hilt. The metal was cool, familiar. For a brief moment his posture settled, as though something within him recognized the weight, the balance, the simplicity of it. Mara watched him. "That one suits you," she said quietly. Elrin did not respond at once. His gaze remained on the blade. Then, slowly, his grip loosened. "No," he said. Mara blinked. "No." Elrin placed the dagger back. "It suits what I've done," he said. "Not what we're here for." Thorn gave a low, approving hum. Selvi's eyes flickered with quiet understanding. That left only one. The book. Selvi stood before it, unchanged in her stillness, her gaze steady, her breath even. The clasp remained closed. The leather cover bore no marking, yet of all the objects in the room it felt the most present. Elrin stepped closer, the lantern's glow settling between them. "You knew," he said softly. Selvi did not look away. "I suspected," she replied. Mara crossed her arms lightly. "And if it's wrong?" Selvi's fingers moved, resting gently against the clasp. "Then we learn something," she said. Thorn glanced at the other pedestals. "And if it's right?" Selvi's expression softened just slightly. "Then the library does as well." She opened the clasp. The sound was quiet, a small shift of metal against leather, yet it seemed to carry further than it should have. The chamber responded, not with movement but with attention. Selvi lifted the cover. The pages within were not blank, nor were they filled in any way the others could immediately understand. Lines of script traced across them, shifting faintly, as though the ink itself had not yet settled into a final form. Selvi's eyes moved across the first page. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, "It's not a record," she said. Elrin leaned slightly closer. "What is it?" Selvi turned the page. The script shifted again. "Not what has been," she continued. "Not what will be." Mara stepped nearer, her voice low. "Then what?" Selvi's fingers rested lightly against the paper. "It's what is being chosen," she said. The lantern flame flickered once more, softer now. The chamber held steady. The other pedestals remained unchanged, but the space itself felt aligned, as though something within the library had reached a quiet conclusion. Selvi closed the book. The shifting script faded from view. She did not return it to the pedestal. Instead, she held it carefully, not as one claims an object, but as one carries something that has agreed to be taken. Thorn let out a slow breath. "So that's it then," he said. Selvi nodded once. "Yes." Mara glanced toward the passage beyond. "And now?" Selvi's gaze lifted, meeting the darkness ahead. "Now it lets us continue," she said. Behind them, the chamber remained as it had been. The dagger, the vial, the key, each untouched, each waiting for a choice that had not been made. And before them, the corridor stretched onward, deeper into the library's quiet design. Elrin raised the lantern. Mara adjusted her stance. Thorn stepped beside them. Selvi held the book close, its weight steady, its presence aware. Together they moved forward, and as they crossed the threshold beyond the chamber, the faintest shift passed through the stone behind them. Not closing, not sealing, but remembering. The corridor beyond the chamber felt different from the ones before, not narrower, not darker, but quieter in a way that settled deeper than the absence of sound. Their steps no longer echoed as clearly. The air did not carry their movement back to them, it simply received it and let it pass. Elrin walked at the front, the lantern steady in his hand, its light no longer stretching as far ahead as it once had. The glow seemed to draw closer to them, holding its warmth near as though the space ahead chose not to be fully revealed. Mara followed close behind, her attention moving less to the walls now, and more to the space between them, as if expecting something to cross that distance without warning. Thorn walked with the same steady pace, though his gaze had grown more distant, as though he listened not for what was present, but for what had been left behind. Selvi remained at the rear, the book resting lightly against her hands. It did not weigh heavily, but it was not without presence. The stone beneath their feet shifted in texture as they moved, from smooth to faintly worn, then back again, as though different paths had crossed here over time, overlapping in ways that no longer followed a single direction. Selvi noticed first. "These paths," she said quietly, "they don't all lead forward." Elrin slowed. "You mean they loop?" Selvi shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "they intersect." Mara frowned. "With what?" Selvi's eyes lifted toward the dark ahead. "With other routes that no longer exist." Thorn let out a low breath. "That's reassuring." Selvi's lips curved faintly. "It's not meant to be." The corridor widened slowly, not into a chamber, but into something less defined. The walls no longer held a clear boundary. They softened, their edges blending into shadow, their surfaces less distinct. The ceiling lifted higher, though it remained unseen. The lantern's glow drifted outward, and then seemed to hesitate. Elrin paused. "This isn't a room," he said. Mara stepped beside him, her gaze narrowing. "No," she agreed, "it's not." Thorn moved forward a step, testing the ground. His boot met stone, then something that felt like stone, but gave slightly beneath the weight. He stepped back at once. "Careful," he said. Selvi approached, her eyes scanning the floor. There were no lines here, no patterns, only a surface that appeared solid, and yet held a subtle uncertainty beneath it. "This place isn't fixed," she said. Elrin adjusted the lantern, lowering it closer to the ground. The light revealed faint variations in the surface, slight shifts in color and texture that might have been dismissed as natural wear, if not for the way they seemed to move when not directly observed. Mara exhaled slowly. "So where do we step?" Selvi considered. "Not where it looks safest," she said. "Where it feels consistent." Thorn gave a small nod. "That I can work with." They moved forward carefully. Each step tested, each movement measured. The ground responded not with sound, but with a subtle change in resistance. Some areas felt firm, certain. Others, less so, as though the surface beneath held more space than it should. Elrin led, the lantern guiding his pace. Mara followed, her steps light, her balance steady. Thorn moved with deliberate weight, adjusting as needed, his awareness anchored in each point of contact. Selvi came last, her attention divided between the ground and the book in her hands. The pages had not moved, yet she felt something. Not a pull, not a voice, but a presence that aligned with the space around them. After some time, the ground steadied. The shifting beneath their feet gave way to solid stone once more, the surface smooth, unbroken. The walls returned, rising clearly at the edges of the space, their presence defined again. And ahead, a door, not like the first. This one stood open, its frame carved with symbols far more intricate than those at the entrance, each line precise, each shape deliberate. The carvings did not fade into the stone. They remained sharp, as though they had been made recently, or perhaps never aged at all. Beyond it, a chamber, large, still, and at its center, a pedestal. Only one. Elrin slowed as they approached. The lantern's glow reached the threshold, then slipped inside, revealing the shape of the room. It was vast yet empty. No shelves, no objects, only the pedestal at its center and above it. A faint light, pale and steady, though no source could be seen. Mara stepped beside him. "This is it," she said. Thorn glanced around the chamber. "No traps," he noted. Selvi shook her head. "Not the kind we've seen," she said. Elrin took a step forward. The air changed. Not sharply, not enough to stop him, but enough to be felt. The others followed. The pedestal stood alone. Upon it rested nothing, not yet. Selvi approached slowly, the book in her hand steady, her gaze fixed on the empty surface. Elrin held the lantern closer, its glow settling over the stone. The carvings along its edges were familiar, not identical to those before, but connected, as though part of the same language now more clearly revealed. Mara crossed her arms lightly. "So this is where it goes," she said. Thorn tilted his head. "Or where it's meant to be left." Selvi stood before the pedestal. The book remained closed. For a moment she did not move. The chamber held its stillness, the faint light above casting a soft presence across the space. Then, slowly, she placed the book upon the pedestal. Nothing happened. No sound, no shift in the air, no movement in the light. Mara let out a quiet breath. "That's anticlimactic." Thorn gave a small shrug. "Or it's just waiting." Selvi's hands rested lightly on the cover, her eyes lowered. Then gently, she opened the book. The pages shifted, not with wind, not with motion, but with intent. The script that had once moved faintly now settled into place, the lines forming with clarity, each symbol precise, each mark complete. Elrin leaned closer. "Can you read it?" he asked. Selvi's gaze moved across the page. Her expression did not change, but something within it softened. "Yes," she said. Mara stepped nearer. "What does it say?" Selvi's voice remained calm. "It's not instructions," she said. "Not a warning." Thorn frowned slightly. "Then what?" Selvi turned a page. The script remained, unchanging now. "Names," she said. Mara blinked. "Names of what?" Selvi's fingers traced the lines. "Not objects," she said. "Not books." Elrin's gaze narrowed slightly. "Then what are they?" Selvi looked up, at each of them. "Visitors," she said. The chamber seemed to listen. The faint light above did not flicker. The stone remained still. But the sense of presence returned, stronger now, not watching from a distance but near, attentive, aware. Mara's voice lowered. "And ours?" Selvi's gaze returned to the page. There, at the bottom, where the ink had not yet settled before, 4 new lines had formed, clear, unmistakable. She exhaled quietly. "They're already here," she said. Thorn let out a slow breath. "So that's it," he murmured. Elrin's grip on the lantern eased. "We came to take something," he said. Selvi closed the book gently. "And we did," she replied. Mara glanced around the chamber. "And now?" Selvi's hand rested on the cover. "Now," she said, "it remembers us." The light above the pedestal softened, not dimming, but easing, as though its purpose had been fulfilled. The chamber held its shape. The door behind them remained open. No path closed, no barrier formed. Only a quiet understanding settled into place. Elrin stepped back. Mara followed. Thorn turned toward the exit. Selvi remained a moment longer. Her hand rested on the book, then lifted. She did not take it. The pedestal held it once more, complete. Together they turned, and without haste, began the walk back. The library did not stop them, it did not follow. But as they crossed the threshold once more, the faintest impression lingered behind them, as though the place they had entered was no longer quite the same, and neither were they. They did not speak as they left the chamber. The door stood as it had before, open and without resistance, its carved frame holding its place with quiet certainty. The faint light behind them remained steady, neither calling them back nor urging them forward. Elrin passed through first, the lantern's glow returning to its familiar reach as it crossed the threshold. Mara followed, her gaze lingering just a moment longer within the chamber before she turned away. Thorn stepped through with a final glance behind him, as though marking the space in memory. Selvi came last, her hands now empty, her pace unchanged. The corridor beyond felt different again, not in shape, not in sound, but in the way it no longer seemed to observe. The sense of attention that had followed them through each passage had eased, not vanished, but settled into something quieter, less immediate. Their footsteps returned. Soft echoes followed each movement, drifting along the stone and fading naturally, as they would in any place untouched by careful design. Mara noticed first. "It's letting us go," she said. Thorn gave a small nod. "Feels that way." Elrin adjusted the lantern slightly, its light steady in his grip. "Or it's already done what it needed," he said. Selvi walked just behind them, her gaze moving briefly to the walls, the floor, the air between. "Yes," she said. "That too." The shifting ground they had crossed before no longer wavered beneath their steps. Where once the surface had felt uncertain, it now held firm, the stones solid and unchanging. The faint variations in texture had settled into place, no longer moving at the edge of perception. Thorn tested a step where earlier he had hesitated. It held. He gave a quiet breath. "Easier on the way out," he murmured. Mara let out a faint sound that might have been agreement. "Or we understand it better now." Selvi's expression remained thoughtful. "Or it understands us," she said. No one answered that. They passed through the narrow corridor where the pedestals had stood. The room remained. The dagger lay where it had been placed, the vial still sealed, the key untouched. Nothing had shifted, yet the space felt complete, as though the moment that had once held tension had already resolved itself, leaving only what remained. Elrin slowed slightly as they crossed the center. Mara glanced toward the book that had once rested there. The pedestal was empty now, not abandoned, simply no longer needed. She did not stop. None of them did. The chamber of shelves greeted them once more. The pale book at the center remained upon its stand, unchanged, its surface catching the lantern's glow in the same quiet way as before. Selvi's gaze passed over it without pause. Mara noticed, but said nothing. The shelves held their order. The empty spaces remained. The presence of selection lingered, but no longer pressed against them. They moved through without interruption, and somewhere among the rows, too distant to be placed, something settled, as though a page had turned without being seen. The passage of shifting lines welcomed them again, though now the faint threads beneath the stone did not flicker or drift. They held their pattern, clear and steady, guiding their steps without the need for careful adjustment. Elrin followed them with ease. Mara's movements grew more relaxed. Thorn's stride steadied. Selvi walked without hesitation. The path no longer tested. It simply allowed. At last, the outer chamber came into view. The curved walls, the empty shelves, the sealed silence of the entrance, unchanged as though no time had passed at all. The stone door remained open. A narrow gap, just as before. Beyond it, the faint outline of the forest waited, dim and patient beneath the evening sky. Elrin stepped through first, the lantern's light spilling outward into the open air. The scent of earth returned, the subtle movement of leaves, the distant hum of a world that had never known the stillness beneath the hill. Mara followed, drawing in a slow breath. Thorn stepped out, the tension in his shoulders easing without his notice. Selvi emerged last, the moment she crossed the threshold. The stone door behind them shifted, not abruptly, not with force. It simply moved, sliding back into place with the same quiet certainty with which it had opened. The circle at its center dimmed, the faint lines vanished, and once more the entrance became nothing more than a part of the hillside. Unseen, unmarked. They stood for a time without speaking. The forest stretched around them, its familiar shapes and sounds returning without hesitation. The path they had followed was no longer visible, though the direction remained clear enough. Mara was the first to break the stillness. "Well," she said, her voice low, "we didn't take the book." Thorn gave a small, thoughtful nod. "No," he said, "but we weren't meant to." Elrin lifted the lantern slightly, its glow softer now against the open air. "We found it," he said. "That was enough." Selvi looked back once. The hillside revealed nothing. No trace of stone, no sign of an entrance. Only moss, roots, and the quiet shape of the land as it had always been. "Yes," she said. Her voice carried no doubt. That was enough. They began to walk. The forest received them without question, the path forming beneath their steps once more, subtle but certain. The trees no longer leaned as closely, the air no longer pressed inward. The world had resumed its place. Behind them the library remained, not hidden, not lost, simply waiting. Not for intrusion, not for discovery, but for those who would arrive, not seeking to take, but to understand what was being offered. And somewhere deep within its quiet chambers, upon a pedestal beneath a pale, steady light, a book rested, its pages no longer shifting, its lines complete. 4 names written among many, unfading, unforgotten. The lantern's glow swayed gently as they walked, its light brushing across the path ahead, then settling again. Their steps carried them onward into the open night, where the sky stretched wide above the trees, and the road, though faint, continued without end. And the story, like the place they had left behind, did not close. It simply remained, waiting for the next step, taken quietly, somewhere beyond the edge of what was known.